Davis left the rehab ward in Santa Rosa with a paper bag of prescriptions, a folded discharge sheet, and the quiet belief that home would smell like lemon oil and old books the way he always had. But when the taxi rolled to the curb in front of his one-story ranch, he saw a rental truck nosed into the driveway, and two men in blue shirts carrying his cedar chest past the rose bushes his late mother had planted. Inside, the living room looked like a staging area. Boxes open, drawers yanked, picture frames face down on the carpet, while Marla, his wife of 32 years, stood at the dining table with Celine on speakerphone saying, "Yes, the agent in Milan confirmed the wire." And when Davis said her name the way a person says a ledge is missing under their foot, she didn't come to him, she just pointed at a stack of papers by the sugar bowl and said she had handled everything so he could focus on his health. He read the top page twice before the stamped word transfer stopped swimming. The sale was real, the closing recorded, and a line he had not signed was notarized anyway. He asked when they had planned to tell him, and Marla answered like she was explaining weather. Branston had an offer in Italy, the visas were approved, timing was tight, and the house, this old money pit, had to go while the market was hot. When he said they could rent it for a year and decide later, she shook her head and said he was a burden, the exact word. And Celine's voice chirped through the phone about fresh starts without caretaking. And one of the movers asked if the sunroom furniture was part of the shipment, and Marla said yes without looking away from Davis's face. He felt the old machinist habit of inventory kick in. The narrow cut of her mouth, the way the mantel clock had been boxed but the wedding photo hadn't, the missing set of ledger books from the hall cabinet, the quiet of the refrigerator where there used to be a hum. He asked where his fishing rods were, and a mover said, "Garage, already loaded." And when he stepped into the bedroom, the closet rods were bare except for his two worn flannels and a thrift store sport coat. He folded one flannel into his overnight bag and set the discharge sheet on the dresser like a flag no one had saluted. He tried one last time in the kitchen, where lemon oil still clung to the air from some fast clean. They could speak to a counselor, list the house properly, keep a room for the grandchildren they did not have yet. Marla's eyes went flat and practical, and she said, "You're an adult, handle your own problems." And then she turned to the notary again. He walked outside because the room had narrowed and because the roses were still roses, no matter who held the deed. And he stood there long enough to watch a neighbor slow their car, wave, and then pretend not to see the truck. At dusk, he took a bus to a budget motel off Highway 101, keycard 214, and ate vending machine crackers with motel coffee while the TV showed a game he didn't follow. He thought of calling his older brother before remembering the funeral in March and that small chapel with the American flag folded neat, and he set the phone down. In the morning, he ironed the discharge sheet under a motel Bible and walked to the title office to ask if there was anything to unwound. The clerk was kind, and the answer was no. The signatures were "sufficient for a community property sale under exigent circumstances," a phrase that felt like a stone in his mouth. An attorney in a gray suit said they could fight and maybe win, but it would cost money and time he didn't have. So he thanked her and left with a pamphlet about post-disposition rights he immediately threw away. He rented a studio behind a hardware store month to month, bought 2 milk crates for his clothes, and set his father's old hammer on the counter like a promise. That night he wrote 3 rules on a yellow pad and taped the page to the inside of the cupboard door. Then he lay on his back on a thrifted mattress and listened to the faint rattle of a loose sign on the street and the even, unfamiliar quiet of a house that no longer contained his name. And a small, practical question slid in under the hurt like a bolt through a hinge. Who had notarized a line he never signed, and why had Marla moved so fast while he was gone? Davis woke before sunrise in the studio behind the hardware store and kept his new rules like a metronome. Work, pay what you owe, keep every receipt. So the first week he swept the small room, folded his 2 shirts on the chair, and walked into the store at opening with his cap in hand to ask if they needed help. The owner, a stocky man named Pete, glanced at Davis's steady hands and said he could cut keys on Tuesdays and Thursdays, maybe stock screws and bolts if he didn't mind dust. And by the second Tuesday, Davis had learned the feel of brass blanks biting the wheel and the soft click when a good copy matched the original. He wrote his hours in a notebook, wrote what he spent on eggs, rice, bus fare, and the cheap coffee from the corner bodega, and paper-clipped every little receipt to the page, until the bundle looked like a small book of proof that he existed and paid his way.
He ate simply, worked quietly, and in the spaces between customers, he read the wall charts about pipe thread and anchor sizing so he could answer questions without guessing. People noticed, and older plumbers started asking for the quiet guy who knows the bins. And Pete added a third day, then a fourth, then told him to take the key machine whenever he wanted because the copies came back with thank yous instead of complaints. On Fridays, Davis took a bus to the county recorder's office and asked for copies of the deed and the notary acknowledgement because that loose, ugly thought from the motel had not left him. He paid in cash, slid the papers into a manila folder, and sat at a plastic table under the fluorescent lights, tracing each line with his finger like a machinist checks a drawing. Grant deed recorded December 27th, transfer tax paid, seller signatures, buyer's signatures, notary stamp from a name he recognized vaguely, Carla N., who used to sit 3 pews behind them at church on Christmas. The signature of Davis H. curved in a loop he never used, and a box marked personally appeared sat checked in neat black ink. He did not storm or shout. He just added the copies to the folder, wrote the receipt number in his notebook, and told himself that keeping facts was a kind of strength. In March, Pete asked if he could come in early on Mondays to unload pallets, and Davis said yes, of course, because yes meant hours, and the extra hours meant he could pay the clinic bill from rehab faster. He carried boxes slow and careful so his shoulder did not ache, lined paint cans on shelves until the labels faced out, and fixed a bent hinge on the back door with his father's hammer and 2 new screws, because loose hinges bothered him the way a wrong reading on a micrometer used to. One afternoon, a man in a stained cap asked if anyone could turn a small piece on a lathe, nothing heavy, just clean a burr off a shaft, and Davis said he had run lathes for 30 years. The man gave him an address in Rohnert Park, and the next week Davis spent 3 hours in a small shop cutting a clean shoulder, measuring twice, making a chip curl like ribbon, and when he wiped the machine down, the owner said, "You want a couple shifts a week? We pay honest." And Davis said yes again, because steady work was a kind of shelter. Spring warmed the parking lot and the studio still smelled like dust and old paint, but he added a pot of basil to the windowsill and a second yellow pad for plans that were not bills. On Saturdays, he walked behind the library where a small community garden had cut squares into the soil, and a nurse named Rosa handed him a packet of tomato seeds and said, "Start them now, set them out after last frost." And he listened, because instructions made sense in a world that had not. He wrote down which day he watered and which day he turned the compost, wrote when the first green showed, and brought a paper bag of tomatoes to Pete in June with the kind of pride that does not need to be spoken. He saw Meredith, his mother's cousin, at a church rummage sale, and she squeezed his arm and said to call if he needed anything. He did not ask for money, only for a favor, to hold a copy of the deed and the notary page in her safe box, just in case. And she nodded like a person who understood insurance better than words. The machine shop added a second shift as orders came in for small runs, and when his legs hurt, he sat, and when his hands shook a little, he paused, and he did not try to be 25, he tried to be exact. By winter, he had a small cushion in the bank, the clinic bill paid to zero, and a stack of notebooks that told a straight story from the motel to the present. On New Year's Eve, he boiled spaghetti, wrote "Year 2, hold steady" at the top of a fresh page, and thought again of the checked box beside personally appeared, and the looping signature that was not his, and the question at the center of it all, who decided his yes and no while he was gone, sat there like a quiet hinge he still intended to fix when the right tool came to hand.
Davis measured his life in small, steady upgrades after that first hard winter. The extra shift at the machine shop turned into 2. Pete at the hardware store made him key holder on Mondays, and the notebook of receipts thickened until it looked like a slim ledger. By the end of year 2, he had paid the clinic bill to zero and tucked 3 months of expenses into savings. So in year 3, he let himself think bigger than the studio behind the shop and bought a modest condo on the edge of Santa Rosa with a view of a parking lot and, if he leaned, a slice of oak trees. He moved with 2 milk crates, his father's hammer, the dented thermos, and 3 framed photos, and on the first Saturday he painted the walls the color of clean paper and wrote "HOA dues, don't be late" in the notebook with the same seriousness he once used for lathe tolerances. He kept walking to work at dawn, kept cash in envelopes labeled food and bus, learned how to fix sticky doors for neighbors for $20 and a handshake. And once a month, he took the bus to the recorder's office to check that quiet question about the notary that still lived like a loose hinge in his mind.
He didn't shout, he just kept copies and dates. When the machine shop lost a contract and then regained 2 smaller ones, he adjusted his hours without complaint, and when his shoulder ached, he iced it and told himself the point was not heroics, but exactness. By the end of year 5, the condo had appreciated enough that selling it made sense. He added the gain to his slow savings and found a small 2-bedroom bungalow off a quiet street with a lemon tree in back and a fence that needed work. He liked that it needed him. He set shelves true with a bubble level, replaced a leaky faucet with a simple one that didn't pretend to be fancy, and wrote "gate hinges, check each spring" on a yellow pad now kept on a nail in the pantry. He changed his phone number one more time, stayed off social media, and told the DMV to withhold his address from public requests. People came into his life like good tools. Rosa from the garden would drop off a jar of soup on nights he worked late and show him how to mulch the roses. Meredith called every few months just to hear him say he was doing fine. Pete started calling him the steady hand and meant it as praise. 10 years, almost to the week after the quick sale, on a Tuesday evening while he was labeling a coffee can full of 3-inch decking screws, the phone rang and Meredith's voice came through, careful and low. "They're back. Marla called me for your address. I didn't give it." Davis thanked her, hung up, and did the next right things. He checked the deadbolt, put his papers back in order in the file box, slid Meredith's copy of the deed and notary page into the backup off-site envelope to bring her on Sunday, and went to bed with the practiced calm of a man who had already survived the most important leaving. A month passed and nothing happened. He let himself relax into the work of replacing 2 pickets on the fence and trimming the lemon tree. And then on a warm Saturday, the doorbell rang while he was sanding a sticky window in the guest room. He wiped the dust from his fingers and opened the door to find Marla on the porch, with luggage stacked behind her like a staging area. Beside her stood Celine with 3 children and a square-shouldered man he recognized from a Thanksgiving long ago as Ken, Marla's brother. "Surprise," Marla said in a bright voice that didn't reach her eyes. And before he could answer, the kids poured past his knees into the hallway, touching the framed trout photo, tapping the window glass. Celine sank onto his couch like she had a right to it and said, "Branson put the house in his name, then left us for some Italian girl. We got nothing in the divorce. Prices are crazy. We can't find anything." Marla walked his living room as if measuring it. "The master will work for me. Celine and the kids can take the other room. Ken, you'll have the couch for now." Davis watched the choreography, felt his heart pick up once and then settle, and asked the only question that mattered. "You expect me to take in 6 people for free?" Marla's smile thinned. "We're family," she said. Ken added, "Be a man about it." Celine gestured at a child rubbing hands on the sliding door and said, "You wouldn't put kids out." Davis kept his voice even. 10 years ago, you sold the house while I was in rehab and moved to Europe without telling me. You told me to handle my own problems. You're adults. Handle yours." The room went tight. Marla's face flashed something like anger dressed as injury. "After all my sacrifices, you'd turn your back?" He thought of the motel coffee and the checked personally appeared box under a signature that was not his, and he chose simple words. "No one is staying here. Not tonight, not later." Ken stepped closer, crowding his space a half-inch at a time, and Davis opened the door and stood aside so that leaving was the easier movement. "We'll make this official," Marla said as she gathered a rolling suitcase. "You'll regret this." He didn't answer. He watched them go down the walk, watched the kids scramble into a dented minivan, and closed the door softly because slamming felt like something for younger men. He sat at the kitchen table, wrote the time and the words they had used in his notebook, and then called Meredith to say only, "They found me. If anything comes to you, please keep it." After he hung up, he rinsed the sanding dust from his hands, checked the hinge on the gate like he always did, and felt the house take a long, even breath with him, like a thing built to hold its shape under load. The envelope came on a Thursday afternoon, thick and stiff, and Davis set it on the kitchen table, poured coffee, and opened it with his pocket knife. Inside was a lawsuit that said he owed $4,200 a month to support Marla and dependents, that she was elderly, disabled, without income, and that he had refused to provide housing. He read every page twice, then a third time, and circled dates with a dull pencil. And when he finished, he put the packet on the left side of the table and his notebook on the right and wrote the facts in a clean list so his mind would not run away from him. He called Meredith and said it came, and she said to come by after dinner. She had something for him. He washed the cup, locked the back door out of habit, and drove the slow streets to her small house, where she handed him a manila envelope and scrolled to a recording on her phone. They listened at the kitchen counter while the ice maker clicked and hummed, and Marla's voice came out clear and careless, bragging about a doctor friend who could write it any way we need, saying courts like sad stories and that Davis can finally pay for something. And when the clip ended, Meredith said she had saved the letter too, the one from Italy years ago, the one that called his problems a weight they were glad to drop. He nodded once, thanked her, and put both into his envelope. In the morning, he took the lawsuit and the envelope to an attorney in Petaluma a coworker had named, Claire Walsh, who shook his hand, asked short questions, and said, "Let's build a timeline." So he opened his box and laid out 10 years of neat proof, pay stubs from the hardware store and the machine shop, rent receipts from the studio, the rehab discharge papers dated 2 days before the deed transfer, the condo closing papers, the bungalow mortgage, tax returns, bank statements, and the dog-eared notebook from the motel year. Claire listened without interrupting, then made a list of her own. Get certified copies of the deed and notary acknowledgement, subpoena the clinic that issued the disability notes, transcribe the recording, authenticate the letter, and check the notary commission in the state registry. He went to the recorder's office and paid for fresh, stamped copies, then to the Secretary of State website on a public terminal and typed the notary number from the old acknowledgement. The screen showed the commission had expired 3 months before the sale date. He printed that page and placed it carefully behind the deed. Claire sent a records request to the clinic named in Marla's papers. A week later, an administrator wrote back that no such doctor worked there and no patient matched the file number. Claire marked that with a pink tab and said they would need the custodian of records to say it in court. At home, Davis pulled a banker's box from the closet and assembled a binder with wide tabs: rehab, sale, Europe, work, tax, house, lawsuit, medical, notary, and slid each clear page protector into place until the story did not live only in his head, but on paper anyone could read. He did not stop his routine. He opened the hardware store at 7, cut keys, answered questions about pipe thread, and when his thoughts shifted to the checked, personally appeared box under a signature that was not his, he swept the aisle again, because movement helped. At night he slept, and sometimes woke, and lay in the quiet with the lemon tree shadow on the wall and counted his breaths until the old calm returned. Claire called with more tasks. "Make a list of every time they called you a burden," she said, "and when possible, put a date or a witness next to it." He wrote, "Christmas rehab year, kitchen, handle your own problems," and "phone call to Meredith, recording," and "Italy letter, relieved to be free." He went to the bank branch where a notary named Carla had once worked and learned she had moved years ago. He did not push, he only took down the manager's name and the date, and he told Claire, who filed a complaint with the state so the journal for that day would be located and preserved. The kids from Celine did not appear again at his door, but once he saw the dented minivan idling at the corner and felt the old prickle at the back of his neck. He checked the gate hinge, closed the blinds, and wrote the time in the notebook, because paper catches what nerves cannot hold. 2 weeks later, the clinic's custodian of records sent a sworn declaration about the forged notes. Claire smiled without showing teeth and said, "Good," then slid the transcript of Marla's call across the desk and asked him to read it and mark any words that were untrue. He read it slowly, line by line, and did not lift his pen. He brought the binder to her office on a rainy Monday, and they rehearsed his answers in plain language. Where he was on the day of the sale, who paid which bills, why he said no at the door, how he had lived since then. He did not embellish, he did not guess, he just told the truth in short sentences. When he drove home, the rain had rinsed the dust from the lemon leaves, and a small wind moved the gate. He lifted the latch, tested the swing, and felt the clean click when wood met metal, a sound he trusted more than promises, a sound that said the line he had drawn would hold when the next hard push came.
Davis woke before his alarm on the morning of the hearing, boiled water for coffee he barely tasted, and checked his binder one more time to make sure every tab sat in order: rehab, sale, work, tax, house, lawsuit, medical, notary. Then he put on his clean shirt and drove to the courthouse with 10 extra minutes in case the parking lot was full. At security, he placed the binder in the gray tray and watched it roll through the scanner like a small ship he was sending across a tight channel. Claire met him by the elevators with a calm nod, and they sat together outside Department 12 while a bailiff read a list of names in a flat voice. Marla arrived with Celine, 3 restless kids, and her brother Ken. She leaned on a walker Davis had never seen her use, and Ken wore a soft neck brace that made his shoulders look bigger. Their lawyer, a man with a shiny tie, gathered them into a whispering knot and then led them inside when the clerk called the case. The courtroom felt cooler than the hallway. Davis took the chair next to Claire at the defense table and put his binder where he could reach it. The judge, a gray-haired man who spoke slowly, asked the plaintiffs to begin. Marla's lawyer started with a story about sacrifice and age and a husband who had abandoned a fragile wife, pointing at the walker as if it were a witness. Marla sniffed and dabbed her eyes, saying she had sold the house to pay mounting medical costs, that Davis had refused to help her when she begged, that Europe had been her only option because the stress was killing me. Ken stood and said Davis had slammed a door in the faces of hungry children, and Celine added in a quick, upset tone that there were no rentals a family could afford and that Davis knew our situation but chose pride over people. The lawyer passed up 2 medical certificates and a letter that called Marla permanently disabled, and he asked the court to order $4,200 a month so she could live with dignity. The judge turned to Claire. She stood, opened her folder, and said they would answer with documents and sworn statements. First, she asked Davis 2 simple questions: where he was the week of the sale and who paid his bills for the past 10 years. Davis answered plain, in rehab after a minor stroke, and I paid them myself. And then Claire began to lay exhibits on the evidence table in a neat line. She showed the deed that recorded the sale 2 days after his discharge, the rehab paperwork with the dates underlined, the rent receipts from the studio year, the pay stubs from the hardware store and the machine shop, the condo purchase and sale, the bungalow mortgage, and tax returns that matched the deposits. She moved to the medical notes. The clinic's custodian of records took the stand and, under oath, explained that the doctor named on the certificates did not work there, that the license number belonged to the pediatrician in another county, and that the file number on the form did not exist in their system. The judge asked one question: are these authentic records? And the custodian answered, no, Your Honor. Claire then played a short audio recording. Marla's voice filled the room, steady and careless, saying, my friend can write the disability note any way we need. Courts like sad stories. Davis can finally pay for something. There was no sound in the room for a long second after it ended, except the shuffle of a paper at the clerk's desk. Claire handed up a letter postmarked from Italy in the first year after the sale. The judge reads a passage where Marla wrote that life felt lighter without caretaking and that she was relieved to be free of Davis's problems, and he asked Marla if she had written those words. She said it had been a hard time and looked down at the walker. Finally, Claire addressed the notary page. She produced the Secretary of State printout showing the notary commission had expired 3 months before the deed date, and the court's attention moved to the checked box marked "Personally appeared" next to Davis's name. Claire asked Davis, "Were you present before the notary on that date?" And he answered, "No." She asked nothing more. The judge leaned back, tapped his pen once, and spoke in a slow, even tone. He found the plaintiff's claim not credible, the medical certificates forged, and the narrative contradicted by contemporary records. He dismissed the suit with prejudice, ordered the matter of the forged medical notes referred to the district attorney, and assessed monetary sanctions to cover Davis's costs, and issued a 3-year restraining order barring Marla, Celine, and Ken from contacting or approaching Davis at home or work.
The bailiff told everyone to rise. The judge left. The room exhaled. Ken took one step towards Davis in the aisle as if to speak, but Claire lifted her palm and the bailiff appeared without hurry and said, "Not today." Outside, the sun felt warm on Davis's face. He shook Claire's hand and thanked her for steady work. He drove home without the radio, parked under the small strip of shade by the lemon tree, and carried his binder inside. He set it on the kitchen table, opened it to the last tab marked court, and added the stamped minute order and the receipt for the filing fee. Then he went to the sink, washed a cup, and stood at the window while the light slid over the fence he had fixed in the spring. The case was finished on paper, but the part that mattered most to him was simple. A line he had drawn at his own door had held.
2 years after the hearing, Davis's life moved in quiet lines he could trust. He woke early, brewed coffee, wrote the date at the top of a fresh notebook page, and checked the small list he kept on the fridge: garden, clinic, hardware, walk. Then he stepped onto the back step and felt the cool air while finches argued over the feeder. The lemon tree was heavy now, branches propped with a scrap of cedar he had cut to length, and the fence he'd mended in spring still met the latch with that clean click he liked. On Saturdays, he carried a canvas bag to the library's repair clinic and set out his tools on a folding table. Square, small level, screwdrivers, a box of mixed hinges, and people came with wobbly chairs and drawers that stuck. He showed a high school kid how to sand the edge of a skateboard where the grip tore, and he showed a young mother how to back out a stripped screw without splitting the wood. And each time he said the same thing he had learned the hard way: go slow, be exact, don't force what doesn't fit. Rosa ran the sign-in sheet and brought him a thermos top of soup at noon. Their walks had become habit, one lap around the block after dinner. No rush. In late summer, the district attorney's office mailed a thin letter that said the forged medical notes case had been handled by plea, fines, a record, mandatory community service, and that no appearance from him was needed. He read it standing at the counter, set it under the court tab in the binder, and closed the rings gently. A month later, a state investigator phoned to confirm details about the notary. She said the journal from that week had never been produced, and the commission had been marked non-compliant. "Will there be a hearing?" he asked. "Not for you," she said. He thanked her and wrote the date and time in the notebook, then drew a small box around the words, "Journal missing," and let the pen rest. Because some answers arrive late, and some never do, and he had learned which ones were worth chasing. Meredith sent a postcard from Oregon with a photo of a gray river under a bright sky and the words, "Proud of you," in blue ink. He put it on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a wrench. Pete at the hardware store cut his hours to 3 days when Davis admitted his shoulder barked in the cold. "Stay on the key machine and the questions," Pete said. "Leave the heavy pallets to the boys." And Davis agreed because pride does not fix tendons. One afternoon, a dented minivan rolled slow past the bungalow and kept going. He watched it in the side mirror of his truck, not afraid, not angry, only careful. The restraining order was still in effect until winter, and even after that the door would stay his to open or close. He started a small fund at the community college where the machine shop instructor still kept a wall of old tool posters. He brought a check and a simple note, "For a student who works steady, not a burden." The instructor shook his hand a long time. On a Sunday, he and Rosa pulled the old kitchen faucet and set a new single-handle model with clean lines. He held the flashlight and she checked for leaks while the cabinet smelled like dust and lemons. The supply nuts snugged up true, and when they turned the water on, there was no drip, only a clear stream, a small success you could point to. That night they ate grilled cheese at the table by the window, and he told her about the trout in the photo from 1983, how the river felt cold through his boots, and she told him about a patient who brought her a paper crane after discharge. They stacked the plates and left the television dark. Autumn came in with a thin wind and rain that tapped the porch roof. Davis oiled the gate hinge and sharpened the blades on the old push mower. He replaced the faded number on his mailbox with fresh stick-ons so the numbers looked squared and proud. Some mornings, while the kettle came up, he would open the binder and look at the thin sheaf at the back where the minute order sat. Not because he needed to revisit it, but because he liked the way the file told a straight story now. What happened, what he did, what held. The mystery that used to wake him, the checked box beside personally appeared, the looping signature that was not his, had settled into a small lesson he could carry without heat. Keep your own records, keep your own key, and do not sign what somebody else can use to move you. On the last warm evening before the first frost, he walked the fence line with Rosa, handed her a lemon warm from the tree, and listened to the birds go quiet. When they reached the gate, he lifted the latch and let it fall, and the hinge swung smooth and found its seat with that same clean click, a simple sound that meant the boundary still worked and the house still kept its shape, and that was enough.